Rambles in Florida by R.E.C. Stearns. Part 1. Florida, the land of flowers, the enchanted ground wherein it has been said Ponce de Leon sought for the fountain of perpetual youth, is not far away. The fountain, quite likely, is as remote as ever, but the land which it was said to bless with its ever-flowing and rejuvenating waters can be reached after a journey of a few days from New York by steamship if the traveler is not unpleasantly affected by a sea voyage, or, if the apprehension of rough waters off Hatteras should make out a different route preferable, then by rail to Charleston, thence by steamer over waters generally smooth to Fernandina, stopping on the way at Savannah just long enough to look about and obtain a general idea of the place. Fernandina, situated on Amelia Island, is the principal town upon the east coast of Florida, and of importance, being the eastern terminus of a line of railway which connects the Atlantic Ocean with the Gulf of Mexico. Its population is not far from 1,500. At first sight, it is not prepossessing, but a walk about the place reveals many buildings of pleasing architecture hidden among the trees. Within a small enclosure, not far from the landing, the forefather of the hamlet sleeps. Upon a marble stone may be seen the name of Domingo Fernandez, native of Vigo in Galicia, Spain, born the 4th day of August, 1766, and died the 3rd day of September, 1833, in the 67th year of his age. Señor Fernandez, it is presumed, never found the fabled fountain, or, drinking of its waters, they were powerless to avert the inevitable doom of man. The morning was pleasant, the sun shone brightly, it lighted up the cross and gave roundness to the skull and bones that are carved above his name. From an oak nearby the Spanish moss hung drooping midway to the ground, casting a filmy shadow and hiding a choir of mockingbirds who filled the air with music. Leaving the grave of Fernandez and following the streets, a careful search in the loose sand of which they are composed will disclose fragments of pottery of the size of a penny, perhaps a part of the debris of some aboriginal tribe once camped hereabout, the souvenirs of a race of whose history how little is known. Farther on is an ancient mound of large size, nearly 300 yards in circumference. Undisturbed 10 years ago, its surface was as the builders left it, but its slopes and summit were so changed through the military purposes for which it was used during the recent Civil War that its original proportions are destroyed and its former outline obliterated. About a mile from the town towards the ocean is the lighthouse, built upon somewhat elevated ground, forming with the adjacent buildings and moss-festooned oaks have been of highly picturesque and pleasing scenery. Between the lighthouse and the road to the beach, not far distant, is another mound in the center of an ancient camping ground, the latter covered with bleaching shells, the remnants of unrecorded clam bakes and oyster fests. This mound is much smaller than the first, only about 100 yards in circumference and about 15 feet in height. It was covered with trees and shrubs, the largest of the former being perhaps 9 inches in diameter, their roots penetrating the loose material of which the mound is composed, and in their ramifications wound and twisted among the skeletons of unknown men whose decayed bones crumbled at a touch. Stone implements were found, and in the surrounding field, fragments of earthenware less perishable than the hands that made them. From here to the ocean, the path lies through a low and in some places dense growth of saw palmetto, interspersed with 1 or more species of cactus. The leafy stalks of the former have sharp points along the edges, hence the name, and the prickly cactaceae may be considered the porcupines and hedgehogs of the vegetable kingdom. Though painful to the touch and dangerous to the apparel, they should not be denounced. Many of the cacti, as well as the palmaceae, to which family the saw palmetto belongs, bear delicious fruit, and some species of cacti are the feeding parks of the insect from which the celebrated scarlet dyestuff known as cochineal is derived. Without enlarging upon the merits of the palms and cacti which would require a volume, we will consider the species we have encountered as unworthy representatives of noble families and proceed upon our way. It is hard work for either man or beast toiling through shifting sands, but pressing on, we soon achieve the summit of the Minic mountain range, which the wind and sea always pile up on the landward side of the shore. Descending the slope, we are face to face with old ocean, whose majesty, whether in storm or calm, is ever impressive. The sea is smooth, the surf beats gently on the beach. We pause a while to admire the glories of sky and water, to ponder upon the mysteries of life and form that dwelt within the broad blue bosom of the deep, to peer into the hazy beauty of the atmosphere which hangs like a curtain at the remote horizon, implying hidden and greater beauty beyond, to note the distant sails of coming or departing ships, or watch the gulls riding upon the ripples like tiny shallops at anchor, to recall how, in the north, the wintry winds nipped us on New Year's Day only a week or two ago, and how bland and genial are the breezes here. To behold at our feet, as we follow the more recent drift rose, the rejected treasure which the sea has cast aside. Forms different from any that we have elsewhere found, and each curious in its way. There are but a few seaweeds, algae, on the beach, and not many species of shells. Of some of the species, however, many individuals can be obtained. Here are numerous specimens of the fan mussels, pinna. What is written of the lilies of the field, they toil not, neither do they spin, does not apply to them, for these submarine weavers spin a byssus or beard by which they attach themselves to the bottom of the sea. The byssus serves as a mooring cable, and its fibers are tubular like human hair. When fresh and flexible, gloves and stockings can be woven from it, and at Taranto it is manufactured into articles of wear. According to Ferrani, the byssus is a successful remedy for the earache, but it does not say in what manner it is applied. Pinna rudis, an English species, is sometimes eaten, and Henry and Arthur Adams also mention that some species are used for food. A dead fish half eaten by the birds is not an attractive object. It is in an unsavory state, but doubtless its scales would, under a microscope, astonish us with many lines of beauty. The butterflies, so unlike the fishes in form and habits, also have minute scales, hence the metallic luster and brilliancy of their coloring. Impalpable to the naked eye, their tiny scales resemble the pollen of flowers. Columbus gave a new world to Castile and Leon. But think of the world of enchantment, of the precious treasures that the microscope has opened to all. A thin slice cut from a spine of the sea urchin, Echinus, that we have just picked up, if magnified, would furnish a partial insight to the wonders of its plan of structure. We find the oblong pouch-like egg cases of a species of skate, Rhea, quite common. The texture and color of these pouches are such that a person not knowing would sooner suppose that in some way they rather belonged to the seaweeds, perhaps the pod of the species of alga, than pertaining to the fishes. If we were strolling along the shores of California or Europe, we should meet with the same queer forms. In England, the people call them pixie purses, fairy purses, and so forth. A species of dogfish, Cilium, makes a similar purse-like egg case with long strings at the corners. The skate fishes are eaten in England and appear in the stalls of the Italian fish market in San Francisco. The California species may generally be found, but they are eaten only by the foreign population. The common English skate sometimes attains the weight of 200 pounds. It is used by the fishermen for bait. The skates and dogfishes are not the only marine animals that make curious egg cases. We have here 3 species of univalve shells, called by the Floridians conchs, bisicon, which also make egg cases. Each case is round and flat, about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch in diameter, and 1/6 of an inch in thickness. The edge of each flat case is coarsely ribbed or milled, and numbers of them are strung together, only they are immovable upon the string, which is situated upon one side or edge instead of being central as in a bead necklace. These egg chains are sometimes 2 feet in length, and the cases are frequently bored into by different species of carnivorous mollusks to obtain the contents for food. These conch animals were probably eaten by the Aborigines, as we find the shells quite numerous in their kitchen middens. They are now sometimes eaten by both the whites and Negroes of Florida, but from appearances they must be tough chewing and as indigestible as a rubber boot. At the edge of the beach, rolling in the surf ripples, a large fleet of arc shells is coming ashore. These prettily ribbed bivalves look like the cockles, cardium, but the animal and the hinge are quite different. The velvety epidermis, which generally covers the surface, has been worn off by the friction of sand and water in the surf, exposing the clean white fabric of the shells. Lighted by the sun, they look like a squadron of little dismasted hulls. 2 of the 3 species that we have here obtained are widely distributed and may be picked up near Galveston on the Gulf of Mexico. Some of the family may be found in every sea, and many species are used for food. The animal of Arca grandis, which is found in the Bay of Panama, is eaten by the natives. A single valve of this giant arc sometimes weighs 2 1/4 pounds. Odd valves of the arc shells are found in the shell heaps, but are not common. 1.5 miles from where the road enters the beach are the remains of 2 wrecks. The plankings of their decks and sides has long ago been broken up and swept away by the sea, and the timbers projecting from the sands resemble the ribs of some gigantic mammal. No vestige of name is left. Their wooden skeletons tell of fierce storms when wind and waves, acting in unison, hurled ships and shells and seaweeds like weightless bubbles upon the beach. R.E.C is a sad sight, but the crevices of an old hulk are a fine field for the naturalist, for many forms of marine life have a home therein. Here we found a tiny species of mussel, Mytilus cubitus, and a new species of Siphonaria, a univalve shell shaped like a small shield with elevated lines or ribs radiating from center to circumference. Without further enumerating or spending the prizes that are ours through the bounty of old ocean, we must retrace our steps towards the road, for the sun has so nearly set that its level rays are shining in our eyes. With baskets and pockets packed and full, we jog along, stopping occasionally to pick up a fine specimen of a white bivalve shell, Docinia discus, which is very abundant, thanks to a storm which threw them high and dry above the reach of ordinary tides. The fish crows, Corvus ossifragus, and a large species of blackbird, Quiscavus baratus, are running over the wet sands, stooping sometimes to pick up some tidbit for their suppers. Bidding them goodbye, we hurry on, and after a weary walk of what seemed many miles, made longer by the toilsome tug through sand and chaparral, we reached our haven. Tired as dogs at times are said to be, we gladly cast aside our packs, and after a refreshing wash, rushed to supper with appetites as keen as hungry wolves. The evenings here are chilly, and a fire of the pitch pine wood, Pinus palustris lin, is pleasant aside from the warmth, for its bright flames fill the room with a cheerful light. How glorious is sleep after a day of toil, yet still of pleasure. How gently it descends upon us, how quietly we yield to its embrace. It touches the drowsy eye, and we feel that the day is done and the darkness falls from the wing of night. The end of Part 1. Part 2. The trip across Florida from the Atlantic Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico is made by railroad. Rising with the birds and eating an early breakfast, a 10 minutes walk takes us to the depot, which is about a mile from the hotels. There is no commotion or hustling, no noise of many hackmen, nor crowding of passengers, neither any difficulty in finding a seat. A single car is sufficient to accommodate the few persons that have occasion to travel. Of this small number, probably 1/2 will stop at stations by the way. The principal business of the road is the transportation of freight, and were it not for the extensive business in the forwarding of merchandise, consisting of cotton, rosin, sugar, lumber, and so forth, on account of the steamship connections which form together with this road, a line from New Orleans to New York, by which much time is saved compared with the other routes, it would doubtless prove unprofitable to its proprietors. The ride from the ocean to the Gulf of Mexico absorbs nearly a day, for it will be supper time when we reach Waikiki. The landscape is exceedingly monotonous, and the journey somewhat tiresome. Nevertheless, it affords an opportunity for observation, and a very fair idea of the general character of the country can be obtained. There are no pretty villages with neat houses and bright garden patches to please the eye. A few shabby towns are passed through, or stopped at for a moment to discharge freight or to allow a brace of passengers to get off or on. Away from the sad-looking villages, an isolated cabin or a cluster of huts occupied by tar and rosin makers are passed by. The forest scenery has neither tropical beauty nor the grandeur of the pineries of Maine, Michigan, or California, which so impress the beholder. The prevailing timber is the Pinus palustris, or pitch pine. The trees are not above medium size and stand many paces apart. Hundreds may be seen whose sides are defaced by the rough scars or notches made by the ruthless axes of the pitch gatherers, and some trees have many of these wounds. At one place, there is an extensive establishment for the distillation of the spirits of turpentine, which employs several persons. At other points, sawmills may be seen. The products of the pines are the prime fountain of revenue to the inhabitants of the neighborhood for many miles along the line of the railway. Here as elsewhere within the territory of the United States, the pine tree, and not the palm, contributes wholly or in part to the maintenance of large communities, and although the palms, by their fruits, furnish the chief subsistence for a large portion of the inhabitants of the torrid zone, and entire tribes of men in the valley of the Orinoco live for several months in the year on their fruits, yet it is undoubtedly true that a much greater proportion of the population of the globe are indirectly supplied with their daily food through the generous bounty of the pines than by any other of the forest tribes. Yet perhaps the voluptuous beauty of the palms has inspired the poetic muse more frequently than the sedate bearing and sturdy merits of the noble pines. The art of Carpus incisa is no more the tree of bread to the naked natives of the South Sea Islands than is the pine tree to a greater number of civilized and refined people. But each is glorious in its way. The sallow and sickly faces of many of the people hint strongly of fever and ague. The small size of the cattle shows that the country is overstocked, but that the pasturage is limited and poor. The milk used in the so-called hotels is the condensed milk from the north. The butter is imported, and the beef is stringy and dry. Most of the corn used, at least in this part of the state, is brought from abroad, and the country does not produce the wheat that the people consume. Few fruit trees are seen from the car windows. An occasional orange or peach tree is therefore noticed. We are informed that this is not a fruit region, but that in the vicinity of the St. Johns River and in that part of the state, the orchards are large and numerous. The stranger is impressed by the general flatness of the country. Nothing like an embankment or an excavation upon the line of the road can be seen. The surface is never more than very slightly undulating and is covered with sand, except in such places as are wet or swampy. After a rain, every depression becomes a pool or lake to be in time absorbed by the sand or evaporated by the sun. As the elevation of the land is but little above the sea, the process of draining the surface by the sinking of the water must be exceedingly slow. The topography may be better understood perhaps when we consider that South Florida is but a succession of beaches piled up by the sea, a superstructure of shore debris resting upon ancient coral reefs. This is confirmed by the outcroppings of the old reefs that, projecting from the ground, are visible at various points by the side of the road. In addition to the accumulation of sands, portions of the state have undoubtedly been, and perhaps are still being, gradually elevated. Agassiz estimates that not less than 70,000 years have elapsed since the coral reefs already known to exist in Florida began to grow. What the area of the state may be 700 centuries hence, we can only conjecture. The same agencies are still in active operation. It will, probably, extend much farther in a southerly direction, and the southern part of the state will be greatly widened toward the west. Those insignificant, so far as size is concerned, but persistent workers, the wreath-building masons, the Astroeans, the Meandrinas, and the Porites, are cooperative workers at the present time as during the centuries that have passed. Deep in the sea, the foundations of future reefs are being laid upon which the more ornamental coral workers, the madrepores, will attach their snowy white shrubbery, fringing the surfaces and edges with beautiful forms, an elaborate and graceful finish to otherwise substantial structures. The few tree palmettos or cabbage palms, Chemoerops palmetto, that we have already met indicate that we are approaching the Gulf. As we move along, the number increases and numerous fine specimens are seen. Here the road runs through wet and swampy ground with lagoons and stagnant water upon the right and left. The sun bade us good night nearly an hour ago, and objects not distant are indistinct in the dusk of the twilight. Presently the train moves more slowly, and looking out we see the twinkling of lights. Like a boy traveling in a lonesome place, the locomotive whistles, but with the vim of 1,000 fifers, and then comes to a halt. Out we get into the darkness and look around. Sand is under our feet, and a scanty show of vegetation, principally coarse, wiry marsh grass, is about us, and the air is chilly. With a benediction upon the inventor of overcoats, we wrap ourselves closely and realize that a fireside would be more comfortable than the open air. So, with a Negro for a guide, we start for a public house to await the dawning of another day before farther spying out the pride or nakedness of the land. Waikiki is one of a group of islands known as Cedar Keys. It is of small size, irregular outline, and for the most part sandy and low, though in some places marshy and wet. Here, as at Fernandina, the railroad company have made extensive improvements by the erection of a large freight house and a substantial wharf for the accommodation of steamers that touch here en route to and from New Orleans, Key West, and Havana. The town consists of a few buildings, not remarkable either for architecture or workmanship, and the hotels are a practical joke upon the traveler. From the end of the railroad wharf, the disciple of Isaac Walton can enjoy his favorite pastime by catching trout, which are plenty, and fine fat oysters abound in the neighborhood. Were it not for the fishes and oysters, the fare at the taverns would be wretchedly mean. The scenery as viewed from the long wharf is attractive, other islands of the group being quite near. The old town, as it is called, is much better located in point of elevation than the recent one. It is built upon an island directly opposite from the principal wharf and presents a pleasant appearance. Beyond is the lighthouse, situated upon an eminence on Seahorse Key. Seahorses are, probably, the only horses in or about Cedar Keys, for at R.E.C, the sole beast of burden at the time of our visit was a poor cow, which, harnessed into a dray, was forced to do the hauling for the place. What a commentary upon the progressiveness and business enterprise of our community. Our regard for the sex made us indignant at beholding the degradation of the patient brute. At the south end of R.E.C, there is a group of mounds of unusual size and elevation. The largest and most southerly presents an abrupt face in the beach, having been partially dug away. Its height, as seen from this point, cannot be far from 25 feet. It was, probably before being disturbed, not less than 30 feet. But this, as well as the others of the group, was, like the larger mound near Fernandina, used for military purposes during the recent war. The aggregate thickness of the shell strata, with the intercalated seams of ashes upon the southerly side of the principal mound, and directly facing the sea, is about 20 feet, and composed principally of the valves of oysters, Ostrea virginica, while on the north side of the same mound, the shell deposit is somewhat less in thickness and largely composed of the valves of scallops, Tacten dislocatus, but it must not be understood that the above are the only species of shells found here, for numerous specimens of the mammoth Fasciolaria, F. gigantea, and others of the same family are represented. Large shells of Bisicon perversum and fragments of quahog valves, Mercenaria mortoni Conrad, are quite abundant. Without a further enumeration of the species contained in this, the largest of the R.E.C mounds, we still hastily glance at others nearby. Just north of the above is the second in point of size, but the shell deposit, composed of the same species, is not as thick or deep, while at the northeast is a third mound of exceedingly regular form, also composed of shells. This latter has not been materially defaced, though a house of considerable size has been erected upon its summit. Between the two largest mounds and connecting them is a piece of flat or slightly uneven ground, which was used apparently for burial purposes, for here can be obtained human remains undoubtedly aboriginal. During the war, this island was the asylum for deserters and refugees, and the yellow fever and cholera carried off great numbers. They were buried carelessly, and the unmarked graves are scattered over the higher land of the key. In examining this part of the island, which is covered with various forms of shrubbery, the visitor frequently stumbles over the hidden resting place of some poor victim of pestilential disease. A few trees may be seen here and there growing out of the sides or summits of the mounds. The latter are so crossed and defaced by the embankments, ditches, and rifle pits that it is difficult or impossible to define their original forms and proportions. Before leaving this extensive and interesting cluster of mounds, we ascended to the highest point to obtain a view of the surrounding scenery. Immediately below, and but a few yards from the base of the elevation, a sloping, shelly beach runs gradually down beneath the placid waters of the Gulf. The white sail of a boat, hardly moving in the bland and gentle breeze, and the whiter wings of the circling gulls with islands near and distant, a cloudless sky and the bright sunshine combine to form a scene of quiet and dreamy beauty. Not far from the mounds is a mill, where the soft cedar is sawed into blocks of convenient size for the use of the manufacturers of lead pencils, and in the neighborhood are rude shanties, cabins, and houses that, viewed with the trees and mounds and water, furnish pretty sketches for the drawing book. Not many species of shells can be found upon the beach, though much of interest may be dredged in the deeper water of the channel a few hundred yards from the shore. Upon an old wreck, reached at low tide by means of the boat, a species of murex, M. rufus, may be collected, and the very common littorina, L. irrarata, may be gathered in quantity, sticking to the marsh grass just above the mud. The steamer from New Orleans that is to carry us farther south having unexpectedly arrived, we were prevented from making an examination of the adjoining islands, or as thorough an investigation of the mounds as their importance demanded. Early in the afternoon, we were all aboard, and soon after, the hawsers were cast loose, and the steamer was underway, slowly feeling the course through a crooked and insufficient channel. An hour passed away before we were in deep water enough to admit of a greater speed. The water is so shallow that vessels are compelled to keep a long distance from shore, and the land being flat, but little can be seen from the deck. The mildness of the temperature, the clear sky, and smooth sea made it a delightful trip, and we shall ever remember with pleasure the down voyage from Cedar Keys to Tampa Bay. The end of Part 2. Part 3. From Cedar Keys to Egmont Key is 85 miles. The latter is situated at the mouth of Tampa Bay and is 40 miles from the town of Tampa. Upon it is a lighthouse whose friendly flame shone far across the waters of the Gulf as we steamed along in the early gray of the morning. We had arranged to land at Egmont, wind and wave permitting, as it is good working ground for the naturalist, but a rough sea compelled a change of plan, and we kept on for Tampa. Tampa Bay is divided at its upper portion or head into two smaller bays, one known as Old Tampa Bay from the town of Old Tampa, the other as Hillsborough Bay, which receives a river of the same name. It is upon the southerly bank of the latter that the new or present town of Tampa is located. A very narrow and crooked channel and an insufficient depth of water prevent vessels, excepting very small craft, from reaching the wharves. Consequently, the steamer was anchored some 4 miles below the place. Viewed from the deck, the scenery is attractive, though the shores, as elsewhere, are quite low. As you face the town upon the left hand and a half a mile off is Ballast Point, an ancient reef. Upon the right are islands and the mainland in the distance. In front, the military post of Fort Brooke, with its new buildings half hidden by the sturdy old oaks, Quercus virens, whose stalwart limbs are decked with robes of the long Spanish moss, which hang motionless in the quiet air or flutter like tattered battle flags when moved by a passing breeze. The post is built upon a sloping lawn whose margin is washed by the waters of the bay. In front of the trees is the parade ground. In the center stands a symmetrical flagstaff, from the top of which, far aloft, floats the national flag. There is some little commotion in getting ashore, for everybody and everything have to be transferred to lighters and small vessels. At the time, a transient shower was passing, and the warm rain caused an unpleasant stickiness. It was soon over, however, and we saw our packages placed safely in a 4-ton sloop and seated ourselves upon the top of the cargo like statues upon a pedestal. The lines were let go, and after beating in a light wind, the sloop was at the wharf by noon. When a steamer arrives, the vent is published by a certain number of strokes on the courthouse bell, hence the crowd at the wharf. Friends met us as soon as we landed, and with their assistance, we found an unoccupied house and an unemployed Negro. The former was at once hired for a camp, the latter for a commissary and quartermaster. In 2 hours after landing, we were at rights and housekeeping. Elated with this wonderful dispatch, in the fullness of our joy, we thought the millennium not more than 2 blocks off and rashly named our quarters Camp Delight. But we had unwisely crowed before we were out of the woods, as will presently be seen. The population of Tampa is variously stated at from 800 to 1,000 people of all sizes and colors, but this does not include the millions of fleas that nightly met in mass meeting at Camp Delight and compelled us, both in sorrow and in anger, to change the name to Camp Misery. The fleas of California, the black flies of the Lake Superior swamps, the mosquitoes of the Ohio Valley, all of these we had met on their own ground and never winced, but the fleas of Tampa proved invincible. We thought of the saying of a German poet, "God made the world, but the devil made the flea." The appearance of the town creates a favorable impression, for it is well planned, the streets being wide and regular, and the buildings comely. Many of the streets and yards are ornamented with trees. In some of the latter, the bananas were just shooting up new leaves to replace those that were cut down at Christmas time by an unusual and severe frost. A large specimen of the American aloe, Agave americana, standing in the post office yard, perished from the same cause, though a rose bush near it was loaded with red flowers. Many of the orange trees were full of fruit which was ruined by the fatal blast, and bushels were rotting on the ground. In some sheltered spots or warm places on the shore of Old Tampa Bay, they were untouched, and we had many a feast upon the golden fruit from that neighborhood. The Florida oranges we consider superior to the Mediterranean, Mexican, or Tahitian. They are of large size, good color, and fine flavor. The shaddock, Citrus decumana, also grows in the vicinity of Tampa, and very fine specimens of the fruit were purchased by us at the stores. It is extensively cultivated in the West Indies, and many people prefer it to the orange. It is slightly bitter, and the juice, a mild acid, is cooling and healthful. It is called grapefruit by the Floridians. Not far from our camp is a grove consisting principally of pines of the species Pinus palustris, also called the pitch pine, and long-leaved pine, and P. tuata, known as the loblolly pine, and many may be seen in the streets and elsewhere about the town. They sometimes attain a height of 100 feet, but we have as yet seen none that exceeded 70 feet. The Camoterops cerulata, or saw palmetto, here as everywhere in South Florida, grows luxuriantly in the sandy soil, and just outside of the town it seems to have crowded out all other shrubbery. Without enumerating the many botanical forms that are met with in this section of the country, a few of the prominent species worthy of mention are the sweet bay, Magnolia glauca Linn, which grows to the height of 20 feet with highly perfumed flowers and shining leaves. An isolated colony of this species sheds its fragrance on the colder air of the north, being found in the vicinity of Gloucester, Massachusetts. The southern buckthorn, Frangula caroliniana, Walt, a species of hawthorn, the catalpa or Indian bean, Also the Persea carolinensis, or alligator pear, sometimes called the red bay. The banks of the Hillsborough River at the water's edge are muddy, with a growth of tall, coarse grass. The bivalve shelve, Sirena carolinensis, may here be obtained. Also the pretty low river snail, Narratina reclavata. From the wharves at the proper tide, many fish are caught, principally sheepshead, sargus, and mullet, mugu, both of which are good eating. The supply, however, is quite irregular, and the market therefore cannot be depended upon. Oysters, O. virginica, of excellent quality abound in the bay and can usually be purchased from boats at the wharf. During a portion of the period of our stay at Tampa, the market was well supplied with venison, Cervus virginianus of good quality thanks to the energy and skill of a one-armed hunter residing a few miles away. The hens of Florida deserve favorable mention, if not a diploma, for their daily dividends were too important to be forgotten. Stalking along the muddy margin of the stream may frequently be seen the blue heron, Florida Corellia baird, and the white heron, Herodias egretta gray. There is a California species that much resembles this last, the white or whooping crane, Ardea Herodias lynn, and the egrets, Demogretti pialia baird, with white plumage, and another, D. rufa baird, of a reddish color, are found in this part of the state around the shores of the bay and gulf. Many others of the long or stilt-like bicads of the feathered tribes belonging to the grallatories, or waders, are met with when rambling through the marshes or exploring the bends, inlets, or sloughs of the river, or are seen by us from the boat while rolling up or down the stream. With a scoop net rigged with a long pole, an important and at many times an indispensable implement for the collector, we dipped up from the bed of the stream a small white bivalve shell, Talina, and a single dead specimen of the freshwater mussel, Bunio juenia lea. The Floridian unios have much lighter shells than most of the species found in the tributaries of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. The once famous British pearls were obtained from a species of unio, U. margaritiferus, found in the mountain streams of Great Britain, and the fishery was continued till the end of the last century in Scotland, where the mussels, unios, were obtained in the River Tay by the peasantry previous to harvest time. The British pearl fishery has long ceased to be remunerative. The freshwater mussels must be exceedingly scarce in this vicinity, and in fact for many miles on the western side of Florida, for we found none living, nor a fragment in any of the mounds and shelteeks that we examined. The Portuguese and Spanish narrators of the expedition of De Soto have given absurd accounts of the quantities of pearls in the possession of the natives. It is highly probable that the Indians inhabiting Georgia and Alabama at the time of and prior to the invasion of De Soto lived in part upon the animals of the various species of unio found in the rivers of these states, for heaps of mussel shells are to be seen on our river banks wherever Indians used to live. It may be that the Indians referred to collected the shells solely for the purpose of procuring the pearls. Yet the proportion of shells containing pearls is so small that when, as mentioned in the text, the Portuguese narrative says they obtained 14 bushels of pearls from a certain sepulchre, and as can be found at another place in the text that a common foot soldier whose name is given as Juan Terron had a linen bag in which were 6 pounds of pearls, and elsewhere that everybody, Spanish and Indian, had pearls and as large as filberts. Either the sources from whence the old historians derived their information were unreliable, while the unios, which are probably as abundant in the rivers as heretofore, have to a very great extent ceased to manufacture these much valued concretions. The latter case is hardly supposable. Perhaps 1 shell in 100 might yield a pearl, of which not 1 in 100 would be either clear or of perfect form, and not 1 in many thousands would be as large as a filbert. Between Camp Misery and the river, in wet or springy places, upon the underside of pieces of boards or chips, many snails, Helix, Malvoxus, Parisis, can be collected, and the coffee shell, Balanthus caffea, is close at hand. It is also found in the West Indies. Just outside of the fence that encloses the reservation of Fort Brooke to the south is a good place for obtaining Glandina truncata, a species of snail with the shell of a pink color, sometimes 3 inches long. It looks much like one that is found in Nicaragua. But Glandinas are carnivorous, and our Floridian is a cannibal, and eats without either hesitation or remorse the smaller snail, Helix volvoxus. The eggs of Glandina are of a whitish color, and about the size of a very small pea. It lives in moist grassy places, and a few boards that were on the ground at the locality referred to made an excellent trap. The Glandinas prefer the shade, and in order to protect themselves from the heat of the sun, hid themselves under the boards, which we frequently turned over, always capturing some. Upon one occasion, in addition to several Glandinas, 2 specimens of a beautiful lizard rewarded our search. We had heard at sundry times marvelous stories of numberless snakes of diverse species and of sordid sizes that lay in wait to swallow, crush, or poison unsophisticated strangers. These fearful tales led us to keep a sharp lookout when on the tramp. Either the snakes snuffed danger from afar and hunted their holes, or else they are scarce, as we failed to secure a specimen, though 2 or 3 were seen. We concluded that our informants had in some way deceived their eyes by using the fusil oil which hereabouts is sold for whiskey, 1 dram of which would cause the drinker to see not always snakes, but an entire menagerie. From the time when the serpent made mischief for the human race, through the beguilement of its original mother down to the present day, the snake family have had a bad reputation, and stories illustrating their wickedness, however preposterous, are readily believed. Near the town, and in the immediate vicinity of the spot where Glandinas most do congregate, stands an ancient mound in shape a flattened hemisphere with the plain upside down. Its position is such as to furnish a delightful outlook upon the bay, and a fine view of the surrounding scenery. It is not of large size, being only 160 paces in circumference and 15 feet high. It was formerly more nearly semicircular in perpendicular outline, as the rains of centuries have washed it off at the summit, thus reducing the elevation and consequently increasing the circumference of the base. The mound was covered with grass, and many stately trees are near it, whose grateful proportions form, by contrast with the general flatness of the ground, a conspicuous and charming feature in the landscape. From the investigations made by our party, it was undoubtedly devoted to burial purposes, and but few shells were used in its construction. 6 species of the common marine shells of the neighborhood were collected, also stone implements and pieces of crumbling bones, portions of the skeletons of men. This mound may have been the artificial eminence near the shore, upon which stood the dwelling of the cacique Jarahigua, who bravely opposed the adventurous but cruel Pamphilio de Narvaez in his expedition to Florida in the year 1528, and the meager remnants of a human form whose sepulchre we had rudely violated may have belonged to the outraged and vindictive chief, who, stung by the remembrance of his wrongs, replied to the overtures of De Soto with words of scorn. The end of Part 3. Part 4. It was nearly noon of a delightful day in February when, leaving the city of Tampa, we crossed the Hillsborough River to the opposite bank for the purpose of visiting Rocky Point, which is situated upon Old Tampa Bay. The route, for the greater part of the distance of 7 miles, is through an open forest of pines of the species previously met with. The lack of undergrowth afforded pleasant and shaded vistas in every direction. In following the sandy road, we waded through broad and shallow pools, miniature lakes made by the recent rains, in which we dipped our cans, and drinking found it more palatable than the water from the muddy springs we had just passed. Upon both sides of, and a few rods from, the road are small deep ponds covering perhaps an acre, surrounded with gaunt and leafless cypresses, Daxodium disticum, standing grim and naked in the midst of the forest, hoary, speechless giants whose gnarled limbs seemed to clutch at, while they sustained long-drooping tufts of pendulous moss that, in the somber light, looked more like funeral emblems than living vegetation. Over these glassy lakelets the towering boughs of the cypress met in a dusky arch, and trailing mosses in midair waved like banners that hang on the walls of ancient cathedrals. Deathlike, the silence seemed, and unbroken save by the herons, many specimens of various species of which were seen slowly marching with solemn strides, like veteran soldiers guarding the solitude of the forest. Seating ourselves upon a fallen pine, we halted to rest a while, for walking is warm work on such a day. There are no wildflowers, and in many places no grass, for a fire which the last rain only partially extinguished burned even the scanty sod. Again we started, and moving forward had proceeded but a few rods when up flew a wild turkey, Naliagris gallopavo lin, the only specimen yet met with by us in Florida, and farther on but out of range, a flock of quails, Ortix virginianus. The species is quite pretty. In fact, all of the quails are tidy-looking birds, but the Californians, with their plumed heads, rather lead the others. The small hillocks of sand, of which we have seen at least 100 since we left Tampa, are made by a species of gopher, Geomus penitus rath. The people call them salamanders. The property of the name is not perceptible. 3 or 4 species of Geomus are found in the Pacific states. We have arrived at the edge of the timber. The road no farther winds beneath the shade of the forest, but lies broadly open to a burning sun. It follows for a short distance through a sedgy marsh, with a rank growth upon either side, and terminates at a cluster of cabins which stand upon the sandy margin of the bay. The small, rudely thatched buildings are occupied by a number of workmen engaged in the manufacture of salt. Their apparatus is of the simplest description. It consists of a few kettles or evaporators made by cutting in halves longitudinally the shells or outer cylinders of small steam boilers, which are rudely set in masonry of stone and mud. Into these kettles, the salt water is pumped by hand from a well hole, a large pit dug in the sand into which the water seeps or flows. The evaporation is produced by means of a fire under the kettles, the inflammable pitch pine making an admirable fuel for this purpose. The thatched cabins of the salt makers were quite a novelty to us. They are 15 to 20 feet square and about 6 feet high at the eaves, and the roof is sharply pitched so as to shed the rain rapidly. The frame is made of small poles or saplings upon which the leads of the palmetto are tacked or tied, course after course, overlapped like shingles or weatherboards upon a common house. Sometimes a floor is laid and a board door hung to the frame. An excellent shelter for a warm climate is thus made, sufficiently close for protection against ordinary storms, a good screen from the sun, and open enough to admit of ventilation. Exceeding caution in the use of fire is requisite, and cooking must be done outside and at some distance away. We were kindly furnished with food and lodging by our host, an old Scotch sailor with a bushy beard which rivaled the Spanish moss in color and in length. Like a wolf's was his shaggy beard, his teeth as large and white, his beard of gray and russet blended on his hairy arm imprinted was an anchor azure tinted. After boxing around the globe for a quarter of a century, he finally drifted into this out-of-the-way corner of the planet. With a palmetto cabin, plenty of oysters, game, and fish, he lives a free and easy life with few luxuries and fewer cares. His gun and dog, his boat and fishing gear supply both food and recreation. Like most sailors and sportsmen, he is a good cook. As to his knowledge of the culinary art, inquiry is best answered by the repeated sorties made by us upon the well-cooked rations. Actions speak louder than words. From the salt works, a trail leads across the sands, then through a bit of trampled marsh, over the sands again to shell heaps large and small. There is only one of the heaps of sufficient size to be dignified by the name of mound. This latter covers an area of half an acre and is 15 feet in height at the highest point. It is composed entirely of shells, and the mound and heaps and ridges of shell are, perhaps, the remains of many feasts here enjoyed and celebrated by the tribe, of which R.E.C was chief. From a well hole that was dug to the depth of 8 feet in the principal heap, arrowheads of chalcedony, a sinker of coral stone, and a spoon-shaped implement made from a piece of large conch shell, Bisicon perversum, were obtained. 14 species of shells were collected, of which 9 are the same as found at the Cedar Key mounds, and include the species that are living most abundantly at the present day, and which were generally shot for as food by the Aborigines. The other 5 species are small shells, too small to be collected for the above purpose, and were probably carried to the heaps from their being attached to the shells of the edible mollusks. No fragments of pottery were detected, and nothing to indicate that the mound or any of the heaps were used for burial purposes. The ground outline of this series of heaps is quite irregular, and it appears rather to have been the result of accident than in conformity to any plan. From the shell heaps to the end of Rocky Point is at least a mile. The road or trail follows along the ridge, which consists of beach rubble and debris upon the top of an ancient coral reef. At many places, as well as at the end of the point, the coral rock crops out, and in some localities it is daily washed by the tide. At the water's edge are mangroves, and along the sides of the ridges are pines, palmettos, and buttonwoods, and specimens of the Spanish bayonet, yucca, trees frequently occurred. Logs of the pencil cedar that have drifted away from rafts are lodged along the shore, or have been carried higher up by wind and tide. We turned many of them over and found numerous fine specimens of snails, Helix phovoxus and Helicina orbiculata, and a living scorpion. The spaces between the roots of the mangroves were filled with oysters which had also fastened to the roots, and a species of modiola, closely resembling the common one of the Atlantic coast, M. plicatula, but with somewhat finer sculpture, was abundant. The small oysters that are so common everywhere along the shore, growing near the high water line, are not generally eaten except by the raccoons, hence the common name for them of coon oysters. On the underside of detached lumps of these we found many rare little shells and several of the larger species of mollusks, especially the thorny conch Melongina corona, may be seen prowling around or half buried in the sand at the edges of the oyster bars. The last named species is a famous oyster eater. But the law of compensation here intervenes, for the animal of the thorny conch is in turn eaten by many kinds of fish, for which it is an excellent bait, and it is therefore much used by the fishermen. The Gulf trout also collect them on their own account, and it is quite common to find large shells of this species in their stomachs. The position of the sun told us that it was time to return. The heat was excessive, and constant tramping and stooping had made us tired. Cutting a bunch of palmetto leaves to use as a screen for our heads, we struck a beeline back to the shell heaps. Halfway between the latter and the point, there is a narrow lagoon with dead mangroves standing along its edge. Here we found the screw-shaped shell, Cerathidia, Scaliformis, and the fine Littorina angulifera, the latter on the mangroves high above the reach of the water, and on the grass, or slopely creeping on the surface of the wet sand, the coffee shell, Melampus coffea. The Cerathidia is also found near the salt works, and Littorina irrorata can be gathered in quantities within the stone's throw of the buildings. On our way across the sand from the shell heaps, an army of fiddler crabs hobbled aside, opening ranks to let us pass. After a hearty dinner, we bade ye ancient mariner farewell, and making a straight wake, were at camp by dusk. Remaining in Tampa for a few days awaiting the arrival of letters, and to complete our reconnaissance of the country in the immediate vicinity, we finally abandoned our headquarters and, bidding adieu to Camp Misery and its numberless fleas, we placed our equipment on board of the schooner Santa Maria of St. Mark's, a vessel of 16 tons measurement, and cast loose from the wharf at Tampa at noon of a pleasant Monday in February, en route for Cedar Keys to stop at such islands and points on the way as might be of interest. Proceeding down the bay, we anchored near Ballast Point and grappled up a goodly supply of oysters for the subsistence department, at the same time adding 2 species of shells to our collection which were found adhering to the oysters. From Ballast Point, a few hours' sail in a light breeze brought us to Piney Point, or Point Pinellas, the latter being the common name with the people here. Off this point, there is a comparatively deep water and a fair harbor. This place is believed by many to have been the anchorage ground of De Soto's fleet 330 years ago. The historian says his squadron consisted of 8 large vessels, a caravel and 2 brigantines, all fitted with ample means of conquest and colonization. Besides the ship's crew, his force numbered 1,000 men with 350 horses. The fleet arrived at the mouth of Tampa Bay on Whit Sunday, the 25th day of May, 1539. 300 of his men disembarked on the following Saturday, and the remainder of the force landed on the following day. To the bay, De Soto gave the name of Espiritu Sanctu. The first detachment met with a rough reception, for on the morning after it landed, the savages broke upon the Spaniards, who were carelessly lying around, and with deafening yells drove them in confusion to the water's edge. The latter were speedily reinforced from the vessels and soon dispersed their foes. At Piney Point are numerous shell heaps and mounds. They are covered with a dense vegetation, climbing over prostrate trees or crawling upon hands and knees through a tangled growth of vines and shrubs. We forced our way as best we could from mound to mound, over ground rich with historic interest, and upon a spot which had received the footprints of as brave and adventurous a band of men as have ever walked the earth. If at times our feelings revolt at the outrages committed by them upon the poor Indians, and by their wrongs towards those native chieftains who fought and fell so heroically in the defense of their homes, yet our indignation passes away and is forgotten in the melancholy fate of the invaders. Scarce 3 years had elapsed from the time of their embarkation at Cuba, when nearly the whole train of youthful cavaliers had passed away. Horse and rider alike had perished, and their bones lay reaching midst the savage wilds of America. The mounds are crowned with magnificent specimens of the palmetto. In the vicinity may be seen the Cerasus caroliniana, or wild orange, also sycamores and pines. Various flowering shrubs and vines not in bloom at the time of our visit compose a part of the undergrowth. We were unable to obtain a sufficiently extended view by which we could form an idea of the relation of heap to heap or mound to mound, or ascertain whether any general plan had been pursued in their construction. The Floridians, residents of the neighborhood, believed them to be defensive works that were erected by De Soto. But we could perceive no basis for this belief, as the structures separately viewed are essentially the same as others we had examined. The account of the landing and movements of De Soto thereafter does not show that he remained at or near the place of debarkation, save but for a short time, for the purpose of giving his men a few days' rest after the confinement of shipboard. If he had made this a base or point of support for subsequent operations, it is probable that he would have caused earthworks to have been erected, but otherwise, it would have been unnecessary and useless labor. As above stated, there is nothing in the character of the mounds and heaps that show any difference from similar structures elsewhere met with by us. This locality was undoubtedly the site of a populous Indian town. The ground in the neighborhood is rather above the average height, and the position such as to make it particularly healthful in the summer and autumn. The waters abound with fish at certain seasons, and the neighboring islands furnish abundance of oysters and other mollusks that were apparently considered edible by the Indians. Near this place and inside of the Keys, we gathered for our use as food quantities of quahogs, Mercenaria, Mortonyi, Conrad, of mammoth size and excellent quality, a pair of the empty valves sometimes weighing between 3 and 4 pounds. At low tide can be collected the reversed conch, Bisicon perversum, and the horse conch, Fasciolaria gigantea, of which it is supposed the Indians made their war trumpets. Here also abound not only many smaller, molluscous animals of sufficient size to be important for food, but the thorny conch, Melongena corona, elsewhere alluded to. The bleached shells of the species named are found in all of the kitchen middens on the western coast of Florida as far as we explored. On some of the smaller islands, the pelicans, gulls, and other maritime birds deposit their eggs, and on the larger keys, raccoons and deer are abundant. The occasional visit of a puma, Felis concolor, sometimes arouses the slumberous quietude of the isolated settlements, a quietude at the present day undisturbed by the war whoop of the savage, and seldom broken except by the music of the mockingbirds, or the noisy screeching of the parrots, Conurus carolinensis cule. The great requisite for the sustentation of large numbers of barbarous people exist here now as they did centuries ago. Along the base of a ridge of shells, which is situated so near the edge of the bay as sometimes to be washed by its waves, we picked up several arrowheads and small fragments of pottery. About a half-mile below, a new settler had just planted his stakes and was building a cabin. His nearest neighbor resides 2 miles above. Driven from his native state by the rude and chilling breath of the north wind and suffering from pulmonary troubles, he here seeks and will measurably find what Ponce de Leon sought, the fountain of health, provided he does not succumb to the fever and ague of which there is a chance. Near his new home, there is a creek where alligators, A. Mississippiensis gray, watch with jealous eyes the invasion of their domain. As the presence of the huge reptiles frightened the children when they went to the creek for water, one of our party proceeded to the spot and slaughtered a saurian some 10 feet in length. We were told of cases where pulmonary patients with 1 foot in the grave and 1 hand upon the doorknob evaded eternity at least for a time by eating alligator meat, and alligator oil, we were assured, is specific against pulmonary consumption. If the oil of the alligator has any connection with its power of extending the jaws, we have no doubt a moderate dose might enable the most despondent invalid to grin. Of one fact we are certain: they have no ear for music. A young living specimen 2 feet long from snout to tip of tail, upon which we expended sundry vocal performances of a high order, manifested not the slightest appreciation, and we were never encored. Chagrined at the apathy of the audience, we deliberately insulted it by reciting aloud, and in the most sarcastic manner, the following verse: How cheerfully he seems to grin, how neatly spreads his claws, and welcomes little fishes in with gently smiling jaws. But the voracious beasts not only welcome little fishes in, but frequently attacked dogs and pigs, and instances are known of their attacking children and men. We remained within 2 or 3 miles of the mound anchorage for several days, collecting along the shore, or in the lagoons and marshes. Provided with well-greased long boots, we waded for miles, and at low tide could have crossed from the mainland to the opposite keys, so shallow is the water, had not a narrow but not deep channel prevented. Sometimes at night, we slept by our campfires ashore, or, according to the caprice of the moment, on board of the schooner during the twilight spinning yarns or relating adventures in other places, or listening to the serenade of the drumfishes swimming alongside until sleep, the giver of sweet visions, came. From Point Pinellas, it is but a short sail to Long Key. Upon the easterly side of the latter, we found many specimens of Fasciolaria tulipa and F. distans, but much handsomer shells of these species may be obtained upon the outer shore of the key. Those from the inside are covered with a confervoid growth that is somewhat difficult to remove, and when clean the shells retain a green stain. The southerly end of the island is the best collecting ground. The beautiful winged conch, Strombus alatus jumel, the great cockle, Cardium magnum bom, the heart-shaped cockle, Cardium isocardia lin, a curious thorny oyster, Comma arsenella lamb, and the fine bivalves, Callista, G. gantea, and C. maculata, and many other molluscan forms of interest and beauty are quite numerous. The water deepens rapidly upon the outside of the key, and many species may be found upon the outer beaches that are rarely met with on the shore of the main land. While walking near the edge of the water, the surf rolled up a fine, living specimen of the odd-looking trigonal trunkfish, Lactophorus camelinus decay, sometimes called cowfish, a profile view of the head much resembling that of a cow, and along the drift rows a few specimens of a sea cucumber, Holothuria, which looks like an empty bead purse. There is a large species found in Puget Sound that is eaten by the Indians, and the Holothuria edulis is regularly collected by the Malays in great quantities, dried, and sold to the Chinese, who regard it as a delicacy. We prefer broiled quails. Specimens of the switchlake Gorgonia, Lactogorgia, virgulata, M. edwardia are mixed in with the drift, and attached to the bases of many of the specimens is the queer arc shell, Arcanue lin, called Noah's Ark. Here also are large sponges, shaped somewhat like a vase. The business of sponge collecting is quite profitable. At the present time, there is an increased demand for the coarser species as, after proper preparation, it makes the most excellent filling for pillows and mattresses. The sponges furnish numerous microscopic forms of wonderful beauty, and fossil sponges are found in many of the geologic strata in Great Britain. Having added largely to our collection during our pleasant stay upon Long Key, we again got underway, and early in the afternoon of a mild winter day we came to anchor in the pass at the end of Pine or Piney Key, and soon after went ashore. This little island is one of the most delightful spots on earth. It is covered with vegetation almost to the water's edge. It is encircled by an outer growth of mangroves. Pressing through these and crossing to the opposite side of the key, we passed through successive zones of palmettos, buttonwoods, etc., and intervals where the rank grass is from 3 to 4 feet high. In one of these we made a camp, and all hands went vigorously at work, cutting and hauling the boughs of dead, fallen trees for our night fire. Quite near to the camp is a narrow bayou, which indents the shore so as to resemble a huge drumstick with a knob or head inland. At low tide, this knob or head is separated from the other portion or handle by an oyster bar, from which we obtained a great quantity of delicious oysters of large size. Here also we found many other species of mollusca, some of which are quite rare, including a beautiful cone shell. The sandy part of the oyster bar, as well as the narrow beach, was closely dented with the hoof prints of deer and the footprints of coons. In many places, sturdy thistles and cacti of large size furnished a hiding place for the snails, Helix, Cereolus, and H. uvulifera, and the dense undergrowth a nesting place for the birds. As the sun had sank so far below the treetops as to shade our camping ground, we started our evening fire. Tramping and the salt sea air gave a keenness to the appetite that caused the supper of stewed and roasted oysters to disappear in a marvelous short time. Having finished our repast, we filled our pipes, and from time to time piled fresh fuel on the fire and watched the flashing flames. It was a brilliant night, serene and cloudless, and the moon was near the full. The buttonwoods and palmettos glistened in the silver light which descended from above, and were tinged by the ruddy glow of our huge campfire which lighted them from below, making each tree in the foreground distinct in vivid lines of beauty. The dark recesses of the denser growth occasionally illuminated by a flame which streamed up for a moment, and then disclosed colonnades of pines and palms, standing equidistant and regular as if placed by human hands. It required no flight of the imagination to transform these charming forest vistas into the long, dim aisles of cathedrals, the trunks of the trees forming the pillars, and the graceful leaves of the palmetto, overarched, forming a roof. The groves were God's first temples. We sat up late, enjoying the glories of the night, the last of our outdoor camping in Florida. Early the following morning, we broke camp and prepared for the return trip to Cedar Keys. Hoisting the anchor with a cheerful heave-ho, the sails of Santa Maria soon filled, and we were homeward bound. We gave a farewell look by way of a parting salute to Piney Key, as it stood out bright and beautiful in the purple light of the morning. The slanting sun shone white along the sand, strewn with green seaweeds and with crimson shells, out of the ocean's dim, mysterious cells, jeweling all the broad skirts of the land. Arriving at Cedar Keys after a pleasant voyage, we proceeded homeward over the same route by which we came. The winter climate of Florida is not only healthful but delightful. In the summer, there is danger of contracting fever and ague, and the yellow fever is an occasional visitor. The climactic advantages to the invalid are at the present time counterbalanced by the miserable food and discomforts of the hotels and boarding houses. There are undoubtedly exceptions to the last objection, but they are rare. The expenses of a 3-month trip are quite heavy, and we could make a journey to Europe or California of the same duration for the same cost and live infinitely better in bed and board. In an agricultural point of view, Florida offers no inducements to the emigrant or settler that are not surpassed by many other sections of the country, whether quality of soil, facilities of transportation, accessibility to markets, or variety or capabilities of production are considered. An emigration of enterprising and industrious people in sufficient numbers so as to exercise a controlling influence would, in a few years, effect a great change for the better and place the state in the line of progress. The average Floridian of today understands only one thing, and that is how not to do it. Emigration should be by colonies and should include some mechanics and be well provided with all necessary agricultural and mechanical implements and material in order to be successful, and great care should be exercised in the selection of a location. The trip to Florida, of which these rambles afford a mere outline, was not devoid of scientific interest, and the results will be made known at some future time, either in the Naturalist or some other appropriate publication. The end was read by Rick Kishner for Let to Go.